It is my pleasure to introduce Atiya Strothers, who's a graduate student in the top program. Atiya has just a very interesting background. If you want to learn a little bit about it, she was featured in Diverse Magazine this October, the Diversity Magazine in October. And it's a lovely little piece, so that's cool. She's been interested, and we'll hear some today, in issues surrounding success and trajectories of African American individuals in higher education. She's done an interesting study looking at proteges of Samuel Proctor and done an oral history of those individuals. And today we're going to hear about her work with folks at Hbcus. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Drew, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for being here and making the time to sacrifice out of your day. And welcome back, because this is our first day back on campus, so welcome back. My name, again, is Atiya Strothers, and I'm going to pretty much talk to you about a project that I did that was a book chapter that was recently published and will be released next month. And so, first, please pardon my voice because I do have a sore throat, so just trying to work through it. And so we're going to look at researchers in the eye of the beholder and analysis of faculty experience and research at HBCUs. But before I go any further, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my mother and grandmother, who is actually here, and they came from Philadelphia. So I thank you for being here. Okay, so I like to move. So one thing that I wanted to just kind of highlight is just what my overall research interests are. And that, broadly speaking, my research interest lies in educational equity and access for marginalized populations. But specifically, if you look at my research agenda, I'm trying to really focus on two key areas, and that would be one, faculty diversity and pathways to doctoral pipeline, and two, the intersection of the church and academia. So how did I get to this topic, research is in the eye of the beholder? Where did it come from? So I wanted to first kind of highlight how I got here. When I did my master's here at Rutgers back in 2010, I did my master's paper on Black faculty at historically white institutions. I call them historically white institutions because they are historically white institutions opposed to predominantly white institutions. So when we look at historically Black colleges and universities, I also use the same language in terms of historically white institutions. So this master's paper that I did was on Black faculty at historically white institutions. There was a wealth of information that talked about their experience. I then, moving forward in terms of the book chapter is titled White Faces and Black Places, HBCUs and the White Faculty Experience. And also, there was a wealth of information on that population as well. However, I did not want to do my book chapter on that topic. I actually wanted to focus on Black faculty at HBCUs, because within that dynamic, you have a minority population that now becomes the majority. And so I wanted to fully explore what that experience was. And to my dismay, there was not a lot of research on that area. So take a look at this quote. To invite diversity on campus is not simply an act of charity, it is an act of raw self-interest. Simply put, it will make higher education better than it is. It expands our notion of learning, it widens what we study and how we study. It improves our pedagogy. It adds to our resources and human capital, both in terms of the students and in terms of the people employed by colleges and universities. So this quote really kind of drives my interest in terms of what it is that I do. Being invested in equity in something, as it says, is not just simply an act of charity, it is an act of my own self-interest. But when we look at higher education, because that is what I study higher education, and I know there are not a lot of higher ed folks in the GSC, but I am one of them. So in studying higher education, diversity is something that we really, really focus on. especially when we talk about our students, right? But when we look at our faculty, when we look at our staff, our student body does not always resemble what is present in the classroom and in the people that our students actually work with. So what is the purpose of today? One, I'm going to look at why faculty diversity is necessary. And then I want to look at what the literature suggests, in terms of the experiences of minority faculty at HBCUs, which would be other than Black, and then at historically white institutions, which would be other than white. And then taking a look at who is present at the research table. Where is the gap in research? Why is there a gap? And what are the implications? So those are the questions we're going to be talking about together today. I just like the picture. So. All right, so let's take a look at faculty diversity. Why is faculty diversity? So again, I already expressed that many times the faculty population does not represent the diverse student body. And on another slide, there is more statistical information that shows you kind of how that percentage plays out, okay? So the second thing is most tenured faculty at historically white institutions continue to be white males, and these populations are not fully integrated, right? So we still have that kind of old school white male dominated population in terms of faculty. And then when we look at the doctoral degree attainment and representation over the years, Black faculty are still disproportionately represented. And so you may have seen an increase in terms of the pipeline, because what you'll find is in the argument with faculty diversity, people say, well, they're just not present. They're not there, right? The pipeline is not there. But then you have the other argument that says, well, you might need to try and find the pipeline. You are not looking in the right place for the pipeline. So the doctoral degree attainment has increased over the years. However, when you're looking at what represents our faculty population, it is not representative of that. So let's talk about numbers. I'm not a numbers person, but I know some people are, so let's get into some numbers. When you talk about faculty diversity, in 2009, African Americans accounted for 7% of the total college and university faculty. 7%. Hispanics accounted for 4%, 6% were Asian Pacific Islanders, and whites made up 79% of the population. And this is coming from NCES, the data. So let's go a little bit further. Full-time faculty. This is coming from 2012. Whites were just over 1 million. Blacks, not even quite 100,000. Asian, 86,000. Hispanic, under 60,000. Okay? Let's make this a little bit more pressing. So when you talk about our students, right, nationally, about 30% undergraduate students are considered minority. Compare that to the faculty. You have 12% of full-time faculty. Full-time faculty, right? So we're not talking about adjunct faculty, part-time lecturers, because we could probably make the assumption that a lot of those populations are in those spaces and places as well, right? But when we're talking about full-time faculty, it's 12%. And then with women, roughly half undergrads are women, but roughly 1/3 of the full-time professors are women, okay? So at HBCUs, the percentage of tenured faculty for Blacks is 57% and 27% for whites. Now, what does that look like when we talk about tenured faculty at historically white institutions? For Blacks, it is 4%. For whites, it is 84%. All right, so why, again, is faculty diversity important? I hopefully, if you haven't quoted by now, I hope something has stood out for you thus far. But if not, we'll take it a step further. It is important for students to have faculty that can relate to them from a cultural standpoint and serve as role models, right? Now, that's not to say that if you don't have someone that looks like you, that you cannot have that same relationship. Because I personally have that same relationship with my advisor, right? However, when you talk about putting a face in a place, it is important for them to have those role models. It provides a different and innovative perspective for research and methodologies. And at the same time, it can engage students of all populations and use a wide range of pedagogical methods. Okay? So it kind of makes sense. If you have a diverse faculty, you'll have a diverse interest. They'll use diverse methodologies, and they'll produce diverse research, which will in turn help the institution at large as well as help the students. Now let's take a look at black faculty at historically white institutions. So when you look at the research in terms of the experience that these persons have had, a lot of the research, when you talk about environmental and structural barriers, find these different things in place. One is job satisfaction. Two, the challenge of tenure and promotion. Three, recruitment and retention practices. And four, the doctoral pipeline. And so a lot of times you'll find that black faculty at historically white institutions are very much overworked, because not only do they have to prove themselves in research, but they also have to mentor students. They're usually a token within whatever department they're in. And so because of that, you'll have students that flock to them naturally. So that flock happens even if they don't want it to, right? Which can in turn, if they're in a position where they're up for tenure or promotion, something has to give, right? So Myers and Turner, they suggest that marginalization, tokenism, and a chilly climate are at the heart of this issue, okay? And they also express feelings of isolation, a lack of support, and increased responsibility surrounding committee involvements and mentorships as well, which I just recently talked about. And again, this affects their research negatively. Now let's take a look at white faculty at HBCUs, right? So, when we look at the history, whites have always been a part of HBCUs since their inception. That is not the same for minority faculty at historically white institutions, okay? So you have to keep in mind that these institutions have never had a restriction on race. Therefore, you have plenty of people that are flocking to these schools, and they've been welcoming to these various populations. And so at the bottom, you'll see a picture of the two founders of Spelman College, and those two women are white women. They founded the college, missionaries actually, and it's been kind of a rumor perhaps that maybe they were in a relationship together, but you know, I wasn't there, neither were you, so I guess we don't know. But nonetheless, you have two women there in terms of the founders of Spelman College. So again, a further historical perspective. So pretty much when you talk about HBCUs, why they were created, when they were created, and what their mission was for, these schools were put in place to provide an education for black students at a time when education was not available. And so after in 1895, black professors began replacing the whites. But then by the 30s and 40s, HBCUs employed predominantly black faculty. But by the 1940s, Jews had a strong presence on black campuses as well, because at that time, Jews were not accepted at historically white institutions either. So if I'm a Jew and I'm coming over to the United States and I'm a professor, I'm a faculty member, where am I going to teach? Who is going to accept me? And HBCUs have been that place. So that atmosphere has led to HBCUs being more racially diverse than historically white institutions in terms of the numbers in the faculty. And so they found that white faculty members have had positive experiences in these classrooms. Now there's also research that suggests that could be connected to a power dynamic. And so when you talk about, first of all, the power dynamic within professor versus student, that's one. But then when you talk about the power dynamic within a white professor versus a black student, that's two. So the other thing is that you have to consider that privilege that is connected to the dominant group. Okay? So a seat at the table. Who's present at this whole concept of research? Because that is really what I'm thinking about. On a larger scale, we're talking about the table of research and who it is that is present So again, when I went into doing both of these projects and both of these papers, there was a lot of literature on minority faculty that should say HWIs at historically white institutions. There was a lot of faculty on majority faculty at historically white institutions, minority faculty at HBCUs. But when you talk about this moment in time and this space in time where blacks are actually the majority, I found it to be very ironic that there was not much in terms of the actual experience. So, all right, the gap in research. The research on HBCUs typically focus on faculty governance, college presidents and leadership, desegregation, and production of STEM graduates. Okay? But again, the experience, right? How are they navigating this space? How are they navigating this place? How are they playing on the institution? How is the institution playing on them? That research is lacking. So when I take a look at Palmer, he calls for a more intentional research on student experience, right? And so he talks about HBCUs and how we have this wealth of information about student experience, often compared to the experience at historically white institutions. And what he says is additional research on black students at HBCUs must go beyond what the literature has consistently found to be true about these students. And that is that they are immersed in a supportive climate, and that helps to facilitate their psychosocial development and maximizes their academic success. This is what we know. We know this. Well, if you don't know it, you know it today. But this is what we know. We know this to be true. And so what he is saying is that we have to push the envelope a little bit further, not to dismiss this, but to understand that if we want to fully understand how these students navigate this space, we need to go beyond that. And that is pretty much the same thing that I'm saying in terms of faculty at HBCUs. We have to push the envelope. We have to go beyond the surface in terms of understanding black faculty at HBCUs. So, black faculty at historically white institutions are highly researched. However, there's not a wealth of information regarding black faculty, which I've said is either very minimal or outdated because, to be honest with you, some of the studies I've seen were from 1975. There's another one from 1989, and we are now in 2015. So, again, if we do not challenge ourselves to focus on other aspects of student experiences at HBCUs, we are limiting our ability to provide HBCUs with best practices to help them increase student persistence. And beyond that, I think that we are limiting the whole institution of research, because that is what we do. If we're doing research and creating knowledge, but we have this whole set of institutions and people that are not being explored, it's not just limiting them, it's limiting the whole agenda of research. So, the HBCU faculty argument. So when you look at, again, structural and environmental influences, it's limited. My call is that there should be more focus and attention that goes beyond governance, that goes beyond socialization, and goes beyond non-black faculty. Now, again, tenured faculty at HBCUs, the percentage of tenured faculty is 57%, and then 27% for whites. And I wanted to put this on there again, so this way we can kind of segue into what the actual argument is. The key point, though, is that HBCUs are not at the table when we talk about faculty diversity. And that, I personally think, is an institutional problem. Because when you have institutions that have been welcoming to different audiences ever since their inception, but yet their best practices, the things that they do, how they do it, is not present at the table of research, that is a problem. So, this argument that I present is to answer this question as to why there is a gap. Why is there a lack of research? And why is this population not included when we talk about faculty diversity? The first thing, and this is, I pretty much take two theories and bring them together. The first thing is that, taking a look at Dr. Derek Bell's interest convergence theory. So, the interest convergence theory pretty much says that blacks receive favorable decisions to the extent that their interests coincide with the interests of whites. Okay. Now you have to understand that this came from pretty much a law perspective. and Derek Bell put this in place around 1980. But this particular theory and concept has been applied in a lot of different ways, particularly in education. And so I want to apply it here in this same interest. Pretty much what he's saying is blacks receive a good outcome when we think the whites will get a good outcome as well. Pretty much that's what he's saying. So how can we apply this theory to the institution of research? So one of the very few examples in spaces where blacks are the majority, they're not in position and they're not at this seat at the table. So when you talk about HBCUs being in position to serve as a model, they're not present, right? And so this connects to the interest convergence theory in that this is not a favorable decision that connects to the interests of whites. Therefore, when you talk about the institution of research, they're not present at the table. The next thing is something that a historian, Dr. Stephanie Shaw, she calls socially responsible individualism. And so my premise is that it's twofold, right? I think that it's one on the part of the institution of research, but at the same time, it's also partly on the institution of HBCUs themselves. And I will also take a step back and say that HBCUs are not monolithic institutions. One thing that happens at one HBCU does not reflect what happens at all HBCUs. One student experience, one faculty experience is not the same across the board. And a lot of times, we often do that within our own personal assumptions about these institutions, but also as well in terms of the media and how the media portrays the institution. If you see one thing bad that happens at an HBCU, it's now all HBCUs are doing the same thing. If you see that one college is struggling financially, all HBCUs are struggling financially. So these institutions are not monolithic, and I think that we really need to understand that. And so what she calls socially responsible individualism, right? So she studied black professional women. And what she found is that there's a developmental process that happens where important stakeholders such as parents, teachers, preachers, and community leaders contribute towards this whole development of the individual, right? Now, this same concept is what I'm saying applies to why there's a gap in research. So, one of the things is that, and if you look at this quote at the bottom, HBCUs are concerned with allowing outsiders on their campuses to collect data because institutional leaders think that they might use the data to paint a negative picture of these institutions. Okay, this is Palmer 2014. So, when you think about it, some of the research that is lacking can also be connected to the fact that it's not happening on these campuses because of the same perception, right? So what I'm calling is that as opposed to it being a socially responsible individualism, it would be socially responsible institutionalism. And that is saying that, well, nope, I thought that was another slide. Right? That is pretty much saying that these faculty are in place and that their silence and hesitation is in place because as stakeholders, they're contributing to the development, enhancement, tradition, and longevity of the institution. So my silence contributes in turn to the development and longevity of the institution because if I allow you to come on my campus, interview and talk to my students, interview and talk to my faculty, I have no idea what you are now going to put out in this whole realm of research. I don't know what you're going to say. I don't know what you're going to do. And I don't know how you're going to twist and turn my words, right? So again, when you think about, and this connection to how these institutions and when they were developed and created, how they've been portrayed in the media, and at the same time, how we can do research further, you have to take into account that they have a responsibility to uphold the institution, their development, and their longevity. So again, it's twofold. It's on the side of the institution of research, and it's also on the side of HBCUs as a whole in terms of their silence. All right, so how does this connect to student outcomes? And I'll be out of your way. So, faculty diversity is connect student outcomes because it is important for them to have someone they can relate to. The importance provides a different in terms of perspective for research and methodologies, and also having diverse experiences. So it is important for faculty diversity for students as well as the institution, and my recommendations. So pretty much overall, faculty diversity, as you know, is very critical to the institution and to the students. But the thing is that HBCUs are in position to offer best practices. And so when I talked about how those faculty at historically black colleges and universities had a positive experience, right? So you have studies that suggest that if we can pretty much figure out what it is that they're doing at these institutions and how they're doing it, it can help foster that same environment potentially across the board. At the same time, the institution of research should be challenged to inclusivity. And so if we have these populations that are missing at the table of research, we need to be able to push that envelope. And then lastly, looking at best practices like Hofstra. They have a partnership with Claflin University, which is a historically black college down in South Carolina. And what they do is they have a professor exchange program. And at this program, they send faculty from Claflin up to Hofstra. They have partnerships with faculty there. They're able to do research together. They're able to teach at different courses at Hofstra as well. And so within that partnership, you're helping to push the envelope within the diversity on campus, but as well in terms of including and understanding what it is that they're doing at Claflin. So lastly, diversity in faculty should not only be sought out for the students' advantage. Faculty members have the long-term ability to shape the campus culture and make it more in sync with the rest of the real world. And so, again, when we look at these different populations, right, I think sometimes we often underestimate the power that faculty members have. Because faculty members, for the most part, stay, especially if they're tenured. Students are only here for about 4 or 5 years. Staff members, you never know. They'll probably be here for a while as well. But when you talk about the power that especially tenured faculty members have to change the institution, they are the ones that are here, and they are the ones that remain here. And so when you look at how they can allow your institution to reflect the rest of the world, we have to make sure that we are inclusive of that and that we understand their experiences. And if we want our institutions to reflect our student bodies, we have to make sure that we are finding the pipeline so that our faculty represents that student population, but at the same time, that those people stay. Because if those experiences are not researched, if those experiences are not understood, then they will not be in a position to not only, as we say for students, not only survive, but thrive. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tia. Questions?
Yes, I wanted to know a little bit more about what you meant when you said you're referring to Dr. Derek Bell.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly do you mean by favorable outcomes?
Yeah, I'll go back to the slide. Okay, so again, so Derek Bell, this theory comes out of actually he put out 2 different things. This was the second thing that he put out, but it was, like I said, it was presented around 1980. And so it comes from a law perspective, right? So he's putting this out there to say that blacks receive pretty much favorable judicial outcomes, so policies, laws, things of that nature, when it is in the vested interest of whites. Okay, that's pretty much what he's saying. However, this theory has been applied to many areas in education to say that only certain things will happen or be put in place if whites are now having a vested interest as well. So how am I applying this to the gap in research is pretty simple in that you have a whole group of people, blacks at HBCUs, where they are now the majority. And so there is no vested interest for whites that is found within that space and within that dynamic. And so Therefore, there's no favorable outcome or favorable decision. So pretty much, why should I go into this space and research these students, and not these students, but these, why should I go into that space? What is that giving me? What am I gaining? What am I getting? What is the institution of research gaining and getting from blacks at HBCUs?
So, can you clarify that a little bit? Are you talking about research in general, or research about the HBCUs?
So, kind of both, actually, because when you look at, like I said, when you look at the literature, it's missing. It's literally missing, right? So, it's looking at, again, particularly blacks at HBCUs, black faculty at HBCUs, because there is a wealth of information on white faculty at HBCUs, right? So kind of both, because again, when I showed that picture of the table and who was present at the table, so that's why I say both, because when you look at the broader picture and who's present at the table, everyone is present except for black faculty at HBCUs. And then at the same time, when you go into specifically at HBCUs, again, the research is lacking, or again, outdated or very minimal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I was wondering, there's this leap to, you make this jump to research, that research is sort of the big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But are faculty at HBCUs getting the tenure because of their research accomplishments, or are they responsible more as teaching institutions, and so they're not engaged in as much research, so therefore they're not at the research table because of a different charge, just like small liberal arts colleges wouldn't have as much research going on either.
Mm-hmm. So let me just make sure I first understand your question. So you're asking if black faculty at HBCUs have more of a teaching focus or a research focus?
Yeah.
And then how does that connect to whether or not they're producing the research that would be present at the table?
There's right. So you know, there's this issue of tenure and power at the institution, right?
Right.
And it's very differential.
Right.
And then there's this piece about sitting at the research table, and I'm just trying to connect those two things.
Mm-hmm.
That are you thinking about it as one and the same thing, that research leads to tenure, so the same research has different outcomes at these different institutions,
mm-hmm. or
are there just different criteria operating
right.
within different institutions?
So, I mean, when you look at HBCUs, they probably have more of a teaching focus than would, say, a research one university or institution that's historically white, right? That does not say that they're not in position to produce, or that research is not a part of their agenda as well. And so I think even if that is the case, in terms of whether if they're focused on research or teaching or whatever the case might be, that still does not account for what other people can do, right? Mm-hmm. And so even if I'm not a faculty member, or if I'm not producing research, and I'm not at a HBCU, that does not account for why there is no vested interest when you have, again, best practices that are coming from these institutions. Because at the end of the day, how many people research what's happening, like, right here at home? If I'm here,
yeah.
You don't really research what's happening right here at home. So if I'm at Howard or Spelman or wherever I'm at, I don't always necessarily research what's happening at my home base, right? But why is it that out of all these different scholars and all these different people producing knowledge, when we talk about faculty diversity, why is it that you have models in place that have been in place, but these models have not been investigated or explored? Yes.
Along these lines and sort of what you said, I think you may have answered your own question in your presentation. You talked about a concern or possible reluctance on the part of the people who are in the communities at the HBCU to let outsiders So if there's a reluctance to let anyone in to see, and that is a concern among any population that might be described as vulnerable in some way.
Right.
And that's why, like the IRBs at our institutions, have pay a lot of attention in protocols in terms of protecting people who are, potentially, vulnerable to criticisms or bad outcomes from research being conducted.
Right.
So if there's any kind of community that is reluctant to let anyone in, and there are no members in the community that are motivated to make what goes on there more known by putting stuff into the field,
Right.
then
That's the
where is there any room for there to be, any evolution in what has happened?
Mm-hmm. Right. So that is the dilemma. Exactly right there. And I will say that's not to say that all HBCUs are not welcoming. Again, I don't want to put that out there because these are not monolithic institutions, right? And so I'm not going to say that all of them are that way because there have been recent studies at Morgan State University based upon their engineering programs. There's recent studies on HBCU campuses regarding LGBT populations as well. So there is work being done, right, in terms of people being welcoming and accepting. But you present the dilemma right there. And pretty much I want to make this a topic of discussion so that it is so that we are aware of it, right? Because again, when you have these best practices and models that are not being explored, you have to question and wonder why, and then say, okay, well, what is it that can be done to try and make these things known? And then the other thing too is that media plays a huge part in that, especially when you're talking about HBCUs. So media plays a very, very huge part in how we understand and know what's going on and the perception that is being played out. So, any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.